So this is Making the Familiar Strange, and I'm Jeremy Fricke. I'm Education Director at Tri-Faith Initiative. And yeah, so let's just get right into it. How many of you were at the last Making the Familiar Strange? I mean, that's good then, new people. All right, so basically this program is about looking at particularly the book of Genesis, and especially the first 3 chapters, and having a discussion about the different ways that we look at these stories. So let me share my screen here. All right, so a couple questions I want you to think about while we're looking at the stories together is, number one, is the Eden story hierarchical or is it egalitarian? So does the story focus on creating a, um, a pyramid, if you will, of authority, or does it focus on searching for some kind of equality between different people? And then the second question is, do certain characters prefer this hierarchy, or do certain characters prefer the equality? Okay. And just a couple of notes before we get started. Be respectful, of course. And also, when you respond about your own interpretation or point of view on something, I ask that you speak on behalf of yourself rather than on behalf of a large group of people. You're welcome to talk about anything that you've learned in your own personal life, any religious life. Just speak from your own point of view. And just as a side note, the translations that I use for the text are Robert Alter's The 5 Books of Moses, which is one of my favorite translations of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and then the Sahih International translation of the Quran, which I use just a couple times. All right, so we start with the first conversation about where gender is mentioned in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and that's this first one here. And God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Some versions of this story have this in the plural, and sometimes this is in the singular. How have any of you heard this story before? Do you usually imagine this part of the Genesis story as being a group of people, or is it an individual? This recalls actually one, I believe it's a Greek myth where Zeus is involved. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but the first human has 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 heads, and is all genders, right? And I believe Zeus feels that this being is too powerful, being being basically 2 in 1, and so Zeus splits them in half and forces them to find each other over life, which is kind of the idea behind soulmates, right? So, again, does anyone want to add? Do you see this as one person who is both male and female, or is this multiple people, multitudes of people who are both male and female.
Well,
Can you tell us? I'm sorry. At some point, Jeremy, can you tell us more about how the traditional interpretations of the Abrahamic scriptures see the answers to those questions? Because I don't know that I don't have an answer, but I'm curious to know what other people say is the answer.
Sure. Yeah, I can follow up on it. Eileen, go ahead.
yeah, I was thinking that when he creates Adam, Eve actually comes from his rib, so probably the description, although that's the first time I've ever really thought about it, that it's both in the same creature or being, or that then Eve is separated out of Adam.
Okay.
But I've never really thought of it that way. I've always thought of it as like starts with one, and from one you get two.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, this is getting into the weeds, which is kind of the fun of it. I mean, traditionally, both have been described. I believe that there's quite a few older Jewish sources that suggest that this is one being, whether they are, clearly gendered or not, that they start as one being. I would say that the majority of Christian individuals usually interpret this as a separate story. So, the first chapter of Genesis being kind of an overview of creation, and chapters 2 and 3 being specifics about the human portion of creation. Just because it's one interpretation doesn't mean that it's the right one or the wrong one or any of that, but that's usually, I think that most of the time people interpret it as a specific, or specifically as this is the creation of humanity, male and female, in the image of God, and then the rest of Genesis, or the rest of the Eden story is a separate story in some way. I just also wanted to quote Elizabeth Cady Stanton here, who participated in writing the Woman's Bible. Do any of you know who Elizabeth Cady Stanton is? Yeah. One of the early voting rights advocates. Some people might call her a feminist. Some people might not. She kind of dips her toe in both sides of that. But would anyone like to read the quote there from Elizabeth Cady Stanton?
I'll read it since no one else is jumping in.
Thank you.
As to woman's subjection, for which the canon and the civil law delight to dwell, it is important to note that equal dominion is given to woman over every living thing, but not one word is said giving man dominion over woman.
Right, and she is primarily looking at that first chapter of Genesis. Quite a few archaeologists and historians actually believe that the first chapter of Genesis is not as old as the second and third chapters, which I'm not exactly sure how that plays into how you might interpret the story, but that is a popular point of view. And then I think it's also important to mention that the first human's name is Adam, from Adamah, and I kind of like to refer to it as a dirtling, because it's one word, from the soil, a being from the soil. So the first human is Adam, and it ends up being sort of the first male as well. I'm interested in what people think of the Bible calling the first human and the first man specifically, basically dirtling. So the context of this is,
It seems
God.
born of the earth and not dropped in from somewhere else. That it was created from where you're at instead of someone, being seated from the heavens in a sense.
Right, that's true. That's true. What does that mean to you?
It says a responsibility because we have to take care of our origin, where we started, and not destroy it, because this is who we are, this is where we came from, this is what we were born of, and that it matters that we honor that and not just dominion and rule it, caretaker,
Yeah.
because it's our body.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful.
I think also the translation here, dirt creature, the other is fertile soil, fertile, unending potential of fertile ground. Could be the interpretation of man, humanity.
For sure. Yeah, and being of the soil is not, it does not have a negative connotation in the story, automatically. I think we sometimes put that on it, later today, because dirt is dirty, right? But dirt is also where you grow those plants and where fertility happens and all those other things. So, being a creature of the soil is nothing, negative on its own, right?
And doesn't that also reflect Greek and other mythologies where Mother Earth,
Yeah.
like I think Karen said.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I always thought it kind of meant that life was all connected because we all come from the same place.
Yeah. True. Why do you think animals aren't described as being made from the earth, but humans are?
Because we have brains and can think, and we need to be reminded of that, and the animals don't need that reminder. They know to the core of their being, but we get all high and mighty and hope we're better than that.
Yeah, I like that. So
I'm sorry, could I ask another clarifying question? So these are two different chapters, and in the first one it states God created the human in his image, and in the second one it says God created the human first from the soil. So is the commentary connect those two versions of the telling?
I mean, that's a very good observation. I haven't thought about it that way. I think that's a really interesting thing. It connects back to what was mentioned about Mother Earth as well, right? Where, at least as far as I'm understanding what you're saying like God's image and the soil or the earth are one and the same or very closely connected.
If it's the same author.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I like personally, when I read these stories, I like to say that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much if they're the same author because they're part of the same book, right? And for millennia, people have put these stories together in a way that makes them appear to be one story in some sense. So that's my point of view because I like to, I like to read it.
And then my other question is, in terms of pronouns in the first one, the way the pronouns are stated, him or they, male, female, he created them, is that just this version, or what do the traditional versions use for pronouns here?
I would have to look it up again. I have seen it translated both ways. So my assumption is that the pronoun is unclear in that section. So
It's really
I don't know.
fascinating to read like a transgender teaching on this use of them.
Right.
I just did a quick Google search and it mentioned the NIV and the KJ. NIV is the New International Version, KJV, King James Version of the Christian Bible, has the same he, them, and created them in it. And
Right.
I know those are used a lot in more fundamental churches.
Right. So some of the newer scholarship shows that the first, the he created him is singular, and Hebrew only has gendered pronouns really. So that's partially why this becomes difficult to translate exactly, because a plural of men and women is male in Hebrew and in many languages. But yeah. So, I mean, look into it. Get back to me. I'll look into it too.
Yeah.
So Adam is created, and there's a few things that happen. He's also told to name the animals, I believe, and also he is told to not eat from the tree, and then the woman is created, right? So God says, "It is not good for the human to be alone. I shall make a helpmeet or a sustainer or a partner beside him." So the version that I uses sustainer, because the words there are helper, but also alongside. And the concept of being alongside someone has a level of equality that in our language helper doesn't really convey. Does that make sense? So this is a very difficult passage to translate, because that's not used very often, a helper that has some level of equality. So different people translate this piece differently, but helpmeet is the traditional way. And then, so the woman is created, and she's not Eve yet, right? She is the woman. God creates the woman from either a part or rib of Adam. I think the popular approach is the rib because it's a little more specific, but many people also translate this to part also. There are some, I believe, Talmudic sources that suggest that this part is really more about the spirit, that woman is created from a more spiritual component of the man, for better or for worse, and so yeah, has anyone looked at this in any way other than through the rib, or why is the woman made from the rib if she could be made from a toe or an ear or or a nose, right? The woman could be made from anything.
Well, you do get in some commentary on this, and again, trying to go for the egalitarian piece, and the NIV will say from the side, and so it becomes significant in trying to explain some things that it's not from something that could be seen as dominating or dominated, that it's that side position, whether it's a rib or something else.
I like that.
You too.
That's a pretty popular point of view, especially I actually see that most popular among Muslims in particular, just because we'll get to it in a minute here, but Muslims have a little different point of view on this story in the first place. So therefore does a man leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and they become one flesh. I want to maybe just directly point something out here, that the story shows that the man leaves to cleave unto the woman. And this could be put in the other direction, right? This could be woman leaves her family to cling to the man, which is kind of how I think a lot of more patriarchal societies look at it. But this seems to suggest that marriage is intended to be more matriarchal, right? I find that kind of interesting that it's mentioned that way and not the other way, right? So, there's a whole bunch of things happening here, right? Helper, sustainer, the woman is kind of made second or from Adam. There's sort of an implication of matriarchy. What does this mean about what the male-female relationship is to be before sort of this fruit incident? I'm just calling it that to not give it too much weight about sin and things like that. But what does this all say to you? Does this suggest that there's a level of egalitarianism? Does it suggest that there's a servant-master relationship at this point? What does this mean to all of you? Because this section has been used for centuries at least, if not millennia, to create a more hierarchical relationship between men and women. Especially if you translate, "I shall make a helpmeet beside him," or a helpmeet for him, right?
There's a lot of animal cultures, say the elephant, where the male bachelors, so to speak, leave their family and to look for mates, as opposed to the females coming in to find a mate. And it feels kind of the same way where where it's worded here, man leaving family to go find a wife, find his mate, and kind of mirrored in that, but we don't see it in how it's actually been lived out in our Western cultures, at least.
Right. Yeah. Would anyone else like to add to that? All right. So the next part that really talks about the connections between the two people in Eden at this point, the man and the woman. Would anyone like to read this Genesis 3:6 piece?
The serpent speaks to the woman, "For God knows that on the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will become as gods, knowing good and evil. And the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and that it was delightful to the eyes, and the tree was lovely to look at. And she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her man, and he ate." When God questions them, Adam blames, oh, that's not the verse.
That's fine.
I was like, that's not the verse.
Oh, sorry. I could have done little bullet points there. I apologize. Yeah, so I mean, many of you have heard the traditional view of this is, from St. Augustine, that we have free will, and the woman sins by disobeying, and kind of brings Adam into it as well, by having him participate. Um, so I want to draw attention to a couple of things here. One thing is, I think I mentioned it earlier, that the woman was not made yet when this prohibition was given, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can read this story, right? There is the St. Augustine way. There's also the way of ignorance, that the woman didn't know better, which is not my favorite, but it is an option. And then there's also a few other ways, right? So for one thing, the man is right there the whole time. This does not have a break in it, this, and she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her man, and he ate. He was right there. All right, so he ends up blaming her later, right? But if he was given the direct order and standing right there, he probably should have said something. There's also, so sometimes this is in that it was delightful to the eyes piece, is translated to lust, that it's a similar word to lust, that that the woman lusted after the fruit. But we see something in particular here, at least in my view, that the woman saw that the tree was good for eating. And that means that she can discern goodness at this point, right? This is something that I think a lot of, the millennia and the centuries before in particular did not really want to pay attention to. So we can kind of go down a rabbit hole with what the fruit means in the first place, right? You know good and evil after eating the tree, but she has the ability to see good already. Then that is complicated.
I wish that I could put my finger on this, but I saw a meme this weekend that kind of divided the conversations around religious structure into those who believe from the beginning the statement, it was good, and it was good, from those who believe in the original sin, right? And so I think it's impossible to separate how you read this, for me, to separate this from how I read this, from how I was taught, from the original assumption is it was good, or if I had been raised at the kitchen table that was taught that humanity started with original sin.
Right. That's true. So, so you were not taught original sin in any sense? Is that correct?
I mean, I think that more of the focus in my pediatric version of understanding this story was focused on the creation part of the story, relating to the garden being what was good, right? And even here you say the woman saw the tree and it was good for eating, and I kind of recount the creation story reminder of it was good, and it was good, right? Like that when you think of those 7 days and each time something got created and looking back and saying it was good, as if an invitation to participate.
Right. And that gets complicated when there's a prohibition to some extent against the tree, and also it's good. Those are two different directions that the people can view the garden in some way.
I think this doesn't make it less complicated, because I was kind of, as I've dug into this verse, how I kind of understood that was that they knew everything that was good, So all of the creation was good, as you said, that, if you're thinking that God is walking with them in the cool of the day, having conversations, talking, that they have access to all the good knowledge, but didn't have access to the evil. And so it was that knowing that piece of it and the distinction of it that I've kind of, how I've come to interpret this, at least. Still complicated, but.
I'm sorry, my next question is this one person or many? Again, like if we go back to the first question that you asked, are we talking about one person eating from the apple? Because seriously, if like one person makes a mistake or does the wrong thing, who cares? Like we're all going to do that. But if we're talking about all humanity and this is representing a large contingent of people eating the apple, in quotes, then the story takes on different context if we invite the first question that you asked us into this paragraph.
Right, for sure. Myths, and I'm not using myths in any derogatory way, stories are intended to show, truth, right? Maybe not fact all the time, but truth and representations of reality. So that is also a completely valid way to read it, is to see that individuals in the Bible are representative of groups or tribes or something along those lines. So after they actually, I'm going to go into one more thing. So how many of you have heard of Gnosticism? Okay. So just as kind of a side note of interest, so this is really the pivotal disagreement with pretty much like Gnostic Christians and the Christians who ended up following St. Augustine too. That in this case, they believe that Eve was 100% right, that the right thing to do was to eat the fruit to gain the knowledge, and that to some extent that she is actually an incarnation of the divine feminine in this case, that she is able to make that discernment on her own, and that as such there's a powerful spiritual knowledge that's hidden to people, and Gnostics believe that it's kind of humanity's or the Gnostics' responsibility to find that secret knowledge that Eve gained during this. That's just a side note, because that's just going to make things more complicated. Okay, so after they eat, God questions them, and I'm not going to quote all this, but Adam blames the woman and God to some extent. He says, "The woman that you gave me, right, gave me the fruit," and then the woman blames the serpent for beguiling her, and the serpent never speaks. He's done speaking for the rest of the story. He is done. So, and then God responds by going in reverse order. He curses the serpent, curses the woman, then curses the man. And the man is cursed to have this difficulty working the land. He isn't really given any other curse. He is given that curse, and also in particular that he is expected to grow food of the ground, not just trees. Before this, his food was the fruit of the trees in the garden, and at this point, the man is given basically a curse to toil on the ground and grow plants through the ground as well. The woman cursed with pain in childbirth. Her children must fight serpents, and she is to be ruled by men. Do do you guys think that this is fair? Do you think that why do you think that the curses are so different for the two? And are they curses at all? I mean, we can even ask that question. I'll mention that like Elizabeth Cady Stanton would have said that the last curse is true, that women have been ruled by men, and that's a bad thing. She wasn't very religious herself, so that's pretty much all she wanted to comment on that curse. So what does this tell us about gender roles? And let me see how far. Okay. About gender roles, particularly in the Hebrew Bible.
Actually, I'm sorry, can I make one distinction? Looking.
Yeah.
Is your translation, because I think we get to the rule by men, most the translations I'm looking at is specifically to your husband, which he will rule over you?
Yeah. My apologies. I should have put it that way. You're right. So by your husband, and that relationship is expected, right, to some extent in that curse. So what does this tell you? So I mean, I think that in many ways, because of the way that we have interpreted this story, it actually has dramatically impacted gender roles, right? I mean, there's no doubt that many people still today see men's primary responsibility is to work, and the woman's primary responsibility is children. And that's not to say that it's good or bad in this case, just that is the curse, and it is something, the curse that's given to some extent, and that's something that a lot of people have put as important in their lives. But both, especially honestly in fundamentalist circles, this is taken pretty literally, and not expanded on dramatically. But here, we'll actually look at this same piece of the story in the Quran as well. And would anyone like to read the...
Jeremy, before you move on, can Karen added something in the chat, and she's I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that you have a pause to look at that for a moment.
Yeah, sorry, I can't see the chat when sharing. All right. Oh, yes. Okay. All right. So up to this point, life was just existence, no real purpose in life. Now that they have learned that there is more to life than just good, they have to work. Okay. Yeah. Would anyone like to comment to that?
I mean, I would add that I think the scholarship around the happiness myth is really intriguing to me personally, and the things that I in life have gained from hardship and resilience are perhaps more spiritual and profound than what I've gained from my happiest days. And so I think there's a culture that is suggests that happiness or joy or good is the preferred stance, but in reality, in lived experience, the opposite of that can be fruitful. Mind the pun.
Sorry, I somehow muted myself here. Yeah, no, that's important, and you know, there's a lot of mythology about like, was everything perfect? That's kind of the way that we understand the story, right? We often understand the story as everything was perfect until this point, and then everything is complicated after that. But there's nothing really to say that it wasn't complicated before that also. Let's see here. Yeah, so let's go through.
Sorry, can I ask one more question? Your use of the word mythology
Right.
in discussing biblical text feels like it could be offensive to some who have this conversation from a theological lens as opposed to an academic lens. And can you just unpack that a little bit for me in terms of your choice? I'm not suggesting that it's a wrong choice. I just think we should think about it.
So firstly, so myths are, there's a quote to say that myths are dreams shared by a society, and I don't know if that's the perfect response, but basically, myths get at things that facts can't. They get at things like what is important and what is the meaning of life and why are things the way they are. Facts can't get to that in the same way. Just they can say how something happens. They can say, you know, 2 + 2 = 4, but at the end of the day, you have to decide to some extent how those things make meaning in your life. And mythology is one way that people make meaning out of the circumstances of life by having these shared stories that get at something about truth, right? It's about truth, it's about meaning, it's about you know, placing value on things. And theology in general, it, to me anyway, it doesn't have much to do with whether something is factual or not. It's about truth. We're not going to do like a scientific experiment to find that, you know, that this story literally happened. I'm not really concerned personally whether it did or not. It could have not happened in a literal, factual way. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what it means, and the fact that this meaning can be disputed or shared by groups of people. So when I say mythology, I do not mean that this is just simply stories, but they're deeply meaningful stories that can again be discussed, debated, disputed between groups of people, and that they add value to people's lives in ways that their stories may not.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm. Would anyone like to read this? This is Surah 7, 22-23. This is just a Quranic way to look at this story as well.
I'll read it. So he made them fall through deception. And when they tasted of the tree, their private parts became apparent to them, and they began to fasten together over themselves from the leaves of paradise. And their Lord called to them, "Did I not forbid you from the tree and tell you that Satan is to you a clear enemy?" They said, "O Lord, we have wronged ourselves, and if you do not forgive us and have mercy upon us, we will surely be among the losers."
Just as a side note, the he at the beginning is Satan. There is no serpent in there in the Quran story. It's just Satan. What do you notice about that story? Who is at fault?
More of a they than a she.
Right. And
There's no blame that's being passed down a chain. They just both acknowledge.
right. And in a sense, they don't even really blame Satan in this circumstance, right?
Mhm.
And then would anyone like to read the second one? The 120 through 121.
I can read it.
Okay, thank you.
And Adam and his wife ate of it, and their private parts became apparent to them, and they began to fasten over themselves from the leaves of paradise. And Adam disobeyed his Lord and erred.
Right. So the Quran doesn't give like a point A to point B story of Eden. It's kind of in bits and pieces throughout. That's kind of how the Quran works for a lot of the older Hebrew Bible stories, that they kind of pop up in different chapters depending on the context. So in this case, Adam is given a little more blame, but there actually is no place in the Quran where the woman or Eve is given the majority of the blame, which is, I think, different. Right? I think, on its face, the Hebrew Bible kind of can imply that, but there really isn't any way to interpret that from the Quran.
I wonder, is there a parallel to, well, I know it kind of just builds on previous pieces, but because as much as we kind of use the story in the Hebrew Bible to kind of blame the woman and say she brought it about, then you get the later passages that are through one man, and that, if Adam had not eaten, like really Eve's actions didn't count. It was really his action that then counted and brought sin. And so I'm wondering if there's a parallel with that, or if we even know, because I know it doesn't go much into detail.
I mean, there's no doubt that that the stories of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible are moving around at the time of the Quran as well. That they all kind of intermingle with each other, and to some extent, one of the things that Islam teaches is that it refines the stories of the past, that the stories are true, but maybe not accurate. So there's some of that. That's part of what Islam intends to be. So I also want to go into one thing that Qu'ran mentioned. So there are some traditions also that believe that there were two women at the beginning of the story, one in chapter 1 and one in chapters 2 through 3. And the first one was Lilith, who has been interpreted in many different ways, but the traditional story is that she's created from the soil as well, or from the same substance as Adam, and she is told to be a servant, but she refuses and says that she is equal. She is made of the same substance as Adam, and she ends up being punished and set outside the garden, and in some traditions she becomes a demon. This has been a pretty popular story for more feminist interpretations of the creation story. Sometimes you'll also see that some people interpret Lilith and Eve to be the same. There's a lot of ways to go through that story. But yeah, did you want to add any more to that, Karen?
No, that's a great overview for this piece of it.
Yeah, definitely look at it. Look up Lilith online. It's an interesting story. And just kind of as sort of a closing question here, after the curse is done, like right after, the very first action that happens is Adam names the woman Eve. She is not named Eve until she's cursed, and Eve means, the mother of life, or the mother of the living, mother, like creator. This seems to me to be a very positive name, which is interesting if she is being cursed alongside Adam. And I'm wondering what everyone thinks of that. Why does Adam name her this then? It would, to me anyway, it would make more sense, especially if he named her that after she gave birth or right away. And I believe this is the only time in the Bible where God names someone and then a human renames. So God names woman because she was made from man, right? And Adam names the woman Eve. And that could be its own complete thing, I think. But if anyone has any first thoughts, I'd be interested in hearing them for sure.
My first thought would be that since Adam ate the fruit and then he became very knowledgeable by eating of the fruit, not only did he see that they were naked and needed to cover themselves up, but he may have also seen other things in the future and things that otherwise he would not have known. And so he named her Eve because he knew that she would be that mother of life, that she would be the one giving birth to the children, and decided to name her more appropriately Eve than what she was originally named.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have any additional?
Like Karen said something similar in the chat, that part of growing up is understanding the truth of things. So he learned just what the truth of the woman is.
Maybe being a helpmeet is different than being a mother.
Okay. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, and Karen, I've read that a couple of times as well, that the blame piece is potentially part of or a major part of the problem, rather than the eating of the fruit, or an equal part. You can read it a lot of different ways. Well, I think if anyone has any questions or anything, I'm happy to go through any. If anyone wants to discuss any points that we didn't get to go through, I would love to discuss them. I also want to post. That's a It's a survey link. If everyone could take that survey link, I'd appreciate that. But again, if you have any other questions or discussion things that you'd like to go through, this is one of my favorite topics, and it's one of those things where I feel like an entire course could be written about just gender in Eden. So I apologize if we went through any details that you wanted to go into more detail about during this. Yes, Lisa. I see you have your hand raised.
Hang on, I had to go from hand raised to mute. Just a brief thought that doesn't probably mean anything except that it's interesting that Adam talks about a mother, yet no one had a mother in those days. There was, I mean, if God was a father, maybe, but they didn't know from a mother. I just think it's kind of an interesting point, but that's all I have to say. I don't know what that means.
I mean, that's valid. That's valid. Yeah. I don't know either, but it's fun to think about.
Well, it's interesting that I'm wondering, yeah, this is the other, the not nice thing is that Adam, and if I'm recalling correctly, was given to name animals. So he had a naming thing. So yay, he named his wife too. But he may have seen in the coupling of the animals, maybe there have been mothers there. So, we're going to do that too.
I've heard, I've had Jewish friends tell me that God is not supposed to just be one sex, that there's divine masculine and feminine. And so that when you leave your father and mother, you're leaving God to go out into the world, kind of a thing. And that's the inherent sin.
I see, yeah.
I never knew what to make of that.
Yeah, I think it's important to go through these stories that we know are very familiar to us, and kind of decide for ourselves a little bit. Listen to different clergy people, different scholars. Just read it for yourself, and ask the questions that are there. Right? Why does Adam rename Eve? Why does the woman get blamed if she wasn't told directly the rule, right? Or was the original person multiple genders, right? And also, and we didn't even get to go through this one, but why does God think Adam is alone in the first place? Adam's got all these animals, he's got God, everything is supposed to be perfect in a lot of points of view. Why is he even lonely in the first place? And what does that say about God feeling lonely? If he can understand that Adam might be lonely, does God feel lonely? And the answer could be no, but I think it's good to think about, how does that affect how you interpret these stories? Well, thank you all so much. And like I said, I'm going to repost the survey once more. And if you can take my survey, I'd appreciate it. And I'm always available if you'd like to email me or anything about just talking about this stuff, have any questions, or if you have any suggestions about future programs along a similar line, I'd be happy to do it. I'm personally in love with the Eden story, the Noah story, especially through this kind of approach, just because there's so much there. But I'm open for anything.
I really enjoyed this, and it was interesting to hear the different perspectives from different holy books. It was, and I think there's a huge course in this.
Yeah. I mean, maybe sometime I'll just make it a course, but for now, I think we're going to do this program monthly, and pay attention to our website or Facebook page or however you get our information for the next one. I think the next one might still be about Eden, but primarily about knowledge and morality, and then we'll probably move on to a different story after the next one. So, yeah.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Thank you again.
It was really good.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.